So if a spider is this large, I don't know that your car's probably just going to crumple into a tin can if you run into this thing.
Exactly. And how are you going to defeat this thing if it attacks you? There isn't a newspaper large enough to roll up in the world.
In 1938, 3 missionaries vanished from a jungle camp in the Congo. Their belongings were untouched. Their tents still stood. But the ground told a different story. Drag marks led away from the site, stretching into darkness between the trees. The only survivor was a man named Robert Hale. He could barely speak. He just kept repeating the same thing over and over again. He said he saw a shadow that moved like many arms, lowering itself from the trees. Colonial officers dismissed his account as fever, malaria hallucination, case closed. But before they left that camp, they collected something strange. Pieces of thick silk found scattered across the site. Silk that didn't match any known spider. Those samples were quietly archived and never investigated again. The Congo rainforest stretches across millions of acres of unexplored territory.
This massive rainforest in the Congo Basin is smaller and less famous than the Amazon. But with 91 billion tons of carbon stored in 2020, or 10 times the annual emissions of the global energy sector,
the tribes who live there have a name for something that moves through the darkness. Something enormous. Something they refuse to call a legend. They call it the J'ba Fofi, the giant spider. And what a trained scientist discovered when he followed their warnings into the forest would change everything we thought we knew about what hunts in the shadows of the world's most dangerous jungle. The warnings nobody believed. For decades, the stories seemed impossible. Missionaries, soldiers, hunters, all telling the same account. Webs stretched across jungle trails thick enough to block entire pathways. Threads that looked like white ropes and vibrated with a force you could feel from several feet away. In the early 1940s, a Congolese soldier serving with the Belgian military staggered into his outpost, covered in thick silk fibers. Medical staff reported he couldn't move his legs for hours. They tested his blood and found traces of venom, but the toxin didn't match any spider on record. Belgian forces sealed off the surrounding area for 6 months. The reason was never explained to the public.
The Baka people immediately give us a warm welcome and allow us to experience a glimpse of what their lives and culture are like. They are one of the most discriminated tribes in Africa. They often are forced to leave their jungle homes and made live in reservations.
Local hunters from the Baka community began reporting something even more disturbing. Monkeys dropping dead with no visible wounds. When they looked closer, the bodies were wrapped in thin silk layers, almost invisible until touched. The corpses were partially drained. Something had fed on them. In another case, a young child wandered away from a village and never returned. The search party found torn clothing beside a large depression in the mud. The impression looked like a footprint, but it was wider than any human track. Deeper than any mark left by a gorilla. Western scientists dismissed every report, exaggeration, folklore, the fever dreams of superstitious jungle dwellers. But the tribes knew something the outsiders refused to understand, and they had rules for surviving it. The rules of the forest. The Baka and Mbuti communities don't treat the J'ba Fofi as mythology. They treat it as a real animal with patterns, behaviors, and reactions that must be respected if you want to stay alive. When outsiders first hear the name J'ba Fofi, they assume it's the only word the tribes use. The elders quickly correct them. J'ba Fofi is a softened version meant for travelers. The real name is spoken only during daylight gatherings because saying it after dark is believed to attract the spider. This isn't superstition. The tribes believe the creature can detect sound vibrations across vast distances. Certain walking paths are avoided completely, not because of legend, because those paths are known for sudden and complete silence. Hunters say when birds, insects, and frogs all stop at the same time, a large predator is present. Silence in the rainforest is never natural. Those zones belong to the spider. The elders share one story they hesitate to speak about. They call it the Night of the White Bones. A hunting party entered a clearing deep inside restricted territory and realized too late they had stepped into a feeding ground. Dozens of skeletons hung from trees and half-finished. Cocoons, thick silk wrapped around bodies that still had flesh attached. The spider had been feeding recently, and it would return. The hunters fled without taking anything. That clearing has been forbidden ever since. When researchers asked why these details were never shared before, the elders gave a simple answer. Outsiders who went searching for the spider often disappeared. Speaking too much about the creature drew attention, and attention meant death. But one scientist refused to stay away.
They're highly venomous, so it will not hesitate to bite when provoked. And that's why a lot of people sometimes kill them on sight. But it's important to remember that even though these spiders can show up in man-made environment, they still have an important role in the ecosystem.
The web that shouldn't exist. Thomas Avery was a trained arachnologist. He understood the tribal warnings, but nothing prepared him for what he found deep inside the forest. The web stretched nearly 3 meters from tree to tree. Every strand was unnaturally thick, almost like fishing wire. When Thomas lifted his machete to test the tension, the blade bent slightly instead of cutting through. He had just encountered a material that exceeded the strength of any known spider silk on Earth. Portable equipment confirmed the silk contained unusual protein chains that bonded with trace metals in the soil. This made the thread stronger and more elastic than anything recorded in arachnology. But the web held something else. Feathers, partially dissolved. Bird bones snapped into clean sections by something strong enough to break them instantly. The dried leg of a small antelope species called a duiker, and caught near the lower section of the web, a torn scrap of what looked like a human shirt. Thomas set up motion-sensing cameras. When he reviewed the footage later, he saw something that made him freeze. One recording captured a massive appendage thicker than a human arm brushing the outer threads. Another camera showed tremors moving through the web with slow, heavy intervals. Something enormous was nearby, watching, waiting. While collecting samples, Thomas accidentally touched a coated section of silk with his wrist. Within seconds, his skin burned and stung later. Analysis revealed the silk carried active digestive enzymes. The web didn't just trap prey, it began breaking down tissue the moment contact was made. The prey didn't even need to be dead for the feeding to begin. And then the spider revealed itself. The attack. Thomas continued deeper into the forest with his guide, Inoshi. The air felt heavy. The insects had gone silent. Even the leaves seemed still. Then came a sharp crack above his head. Something large was moving through the upper branches. Another crack, then rapid shaking through the canopy. Thomas aimed his flashlight upward. The beam barely reached the lower branches, but the movement continued higher. Suddenly, a massive shadow dropped through the leaves. The force of its descent shook nearby trees and knocked debris across a wide circle. When the leaves settled, Thomas saw it clearly. The legs were impossibly long, like thick wooden limbs stretching outward in multiple directions. The body was the size of a man's torso, swollen, heavy. Its eyes reflected the light with a faint golden shimmer. The spider was watching him directly. No confusion, no hesitation. just the posture of a predator evaluating a target. Then it moved. A burst of silk shot through the air and struck Thomas on the shoulder with enough force to knock him sideways. The contact burned through his shirt immediately, venom in the silk reacting with his skin. Inoshi grabbed him and pulled him toward cover. But when Thomas looked back, expecting the creature to chase, it didn't move. It crouched lower on the branch, kept its eyes fixed on them, then slowly retreated into the canopy at a controlled pace, watching them the entire time. Thomas later wrote in his notes that the spider had moved with restraint.
I believe the definition of a cryptid is a creature unknown to science.
Yeah. If they weren't cryptids, if one was alive today, it could be a cryptid.
It wasn't attacking for food. It was testing them, evaluating their reactions, measuring their speed. A predator that tests its prey is far more dangerous than one that attacks blindly. But what Thomas found next proved the legend wrong in the worst possible way. The nest. Thomas believed he was tracking a single creature. That assumption collapsed when he followed a trail of disturbed soil to a section of forest where several large trees had fallen in the same direction. Beneath the collapsed trunks, the ground was hollow. An opening led down into the earth. Warm air pulsed upward from the darkness. Thomas lowered himself inside. The moment his light struck the walls, he understood the legend had failed him completely. Dozens of enormous silk sacks lined the chamber, each one roughly the size of a pumpkin. He counted over 40 before he stopped. Many were split open. Others showed signs of recent hatching. Silk trails led up the walls and disappeared toward the surface. The spiders weren't just surviving, they were breeding, and they had already begun leaving the nest. At the far end of the chamber, movement. Several smaller shapes emerged from the shadows. Their bodies reached the height of a man's waist. They circled in coordinated patterns, shifting left, shifting right, tightening the formation.
I remember one time sleeping back in Northern Ireland, and I woke up because I felt a tickle on my face. And when I opened my eyes, a spider so large it looked like a shadowy hand was clasped onto my face.
As Thomas backed away, his foot struck something buried in the soil. A torn boot, a cracked camera lens, and arranged in a deliberate semicircle, splintered human bones stripped clean by enzymes. Too many bones to belong to one victim. Someone had been here before. Many people had. None of them escaped. Thomas Avery made it out of the forest, but when he returned to base camp, his equipment had been searched. Memory cards missing, notebooks scattered, his satellite communicator disabled. Congolese officials arrived without explanation and escorted him out of the region. His research was seized under the claim of environmental protection. He was never given documentation, never told when his materials would be returned. Authorities continue to deny the existence of the J'ba Fofi. They call it folklore, misinterpretation. Some now argue that Thomas Avery himself never existed, a name invented by believers trying to convince the world the spider is real. But the forest keeps producing massive webs, heat signatures keep spreading, and people continue to vanish in regions where the tribal warnings have never changed. The Congo rainforest covers over 2 million square kilometers. Less than 5% has ever been fully explored. Whatever lives in those shadows doesn't need our belief to survive. It only needs us to keep walking into the dark.